So let's get started. Can you speak a little louder? Sorry, I do hope you were able to hear me. I only saw this now. Next time I will make sure to use a microphone, so you should hear me better. Are skin picking habits connected to our shadows developed as children and teenagers? So I guess your question is about Jungian theory. So I'm not a Jungian analyst, and I have to say my relationship to Jungian theory is very ambivalent. I can see how it's useful, but at the same time, I think he blurs the boundary between psychology and mysticism, which is not something I always find very useful. The answer to your question is a very vague yes, but the specifics of your shadow would then sort of tell you what the relationship would be. But again, like I said in the beginning, two aspects are important there, the habitual aspect and the psychological aspect. So you can explore things, but you still have to form a habit. Turn up the volume. Oh gosh, I'm really sorry. What are the examples of competing responses for skin picking? So using a worry stone, like I showed you, would be a competing response. Sitting on your hand when you feel the urge, using a squeeze toy, using a breathing exercise, using an infinity cube, that's also the competing response. Fidget spinners, anything that would provide relief and kind of be stimulating enough for you to resist picking in that moment. I need to head to another meeting, but thank you for another interesting webinar. Well, you're welcome. And I saw when you sent it, so had I been on time, you would have heard the rest. It's very difficult to pick competing responses because no matter what I choose, I never feel the same relief and really an indescribable feeling sensation that I get from picking. You mentioned that the competing response will never give you the exact same things that the old habit does. Would it be better to engage in multiple competing responses at once so that I can get closer to that feeling that I was originally trying to achieve by picking, since each competing response gives me different things? That's one thing that you can do. But if you combine two competing responses at the same time, for example, that can be quite confusing and challenging to introduce as a habit. That means that you would have to practice sort of two habits all the time. But that is one way, and if that works for you, by all means. I think there are two other ways that come to my mind right now, and I'm sure there are many more. You can combine competing responses with more advanced cognitive techniques like cognitive diffusion, for example. For those of you that are in the program, that's session 3 and session 6. So these two can work very well because they can both be practiced as habits, but they require two different levels of habituation. So it requires you to introduce a mental habit and a physical habit. So that's easier to combine. Another way of thinking about it is what's short-term and what's long-term. Competing response is a short-term strategy. No one ever lost or changed the urge to pick because they've had competing responses. This is just not going to happen. So a competing response will help you in the moment, and it will help you replace the actual movement, and it will help you minimize damage. But the rest is maybe better thought of in psychological terms. So one of the reasons why people frequently pick their skin is to channel their anxiety, to avoid difficult emotions. Another reason would be to self-soothe. So all these are functions that skin picking provides. That means that on a kind of greater scale in your life, you can see how you can self-soothe in a healthy way, how you can reduce anxiety so it doesn't spike in that way. If intense emotions are your issue, maybe practicing equanimity or finding mechanisms of emotional control is a more beneficial thing. So you can introduce the competing response, but at the same time, work on a long-term scale, or on a larger scale. So that way, the rest that picking gives will be unnecessary. It's like the difference between eating chocolate because you like chocolate and eating chocolate because you're hungry. So if you reduce the hunger, then you will eat dessert sometimes because you like it. So competing response can be your dessert, but the basic kind of self-soothing or relaxation or just kind of blocking out the world when you go into the kind of trance-like state, all these will be unnecessary because you will take care of the underlying need. I often hear that it takes at least 21 days to establish a new habit. Yes, they say that, but doesn't, no. I also read today when I was looking at the webinar that it takes 10 weeks. Then I read that it takes 8 weeks, which kind of immediately resonated with me because many SkinPick, for example, takes 8 weeks to complete. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, Jon Kabat-Zinn's program takes 8 weeks to complete. So it's kind of like a frequently used number in all kinds of CBT and psychological courses. But no, not really. Really depends. I wouldn't rely on that. Will the slides be sent out? I have to go. Oh, I'm sorry, you have to go, but you will receive the link to the recording. Is there a way to watch previous webinars? Yes, when you receive the link, you will get a, you can find SkinPick's channel on YouTube, and they have all the recordings and all the Q&As. I haven't separated the Q&As from the recordings because otherwise you would have like a 3-hour clip, which I don't think anyone on earth would watch. So every webinar has 2 parts. What about the relation between skin picking and trauma and self-harm? So this is a very complex topic, and I will actually right now make a note of this because that could be a topic for one of the future webinars. Thank you very much for bringing this up. The reason why I say this is because sometimes, and there goes my pen. So the reason I say this is because sometimes skin picking really is also a form of self-harm, but then at other times it can coexist with self-harm, but it doesn't have to be self-harm. So it's really a very complex thing. I don't think I can summarize an answer like this, but I can roughly say that there is a relationship sometimes, and self-soothing and trauma are obviously connected. So it can be like an echo of a trauma or a coping mechanism of certain consequences of traumas as well. So there absolutely is a connection, and that's also in that case, I think, depending on what the trauma is and how much you work through this, if you have a very acute, serious trauma that let's say if you have skin picking and PTSD coexisting, then you might want to combine skin picking as a program with traditional therapy, or do one or the other, or kind of have them cooperate in some way. Because in my opinion, trauma kind of supersedes this if it's connected. Is there a way to see your previous slides again? I'm not sure if you mean the previous webinars, which I just mentioned, or to go back to the slides. When you get the recording, I suppose you can do whatever you like with slides. Is this program appropriate when there's also an underlying skin condition? Yes, actually, yes. Quite a number of clients have underlying skin conditions, but I do have to caution you in terms of what you can expect out of the program, because that I would then maybe focus on the first half of the program and session 6 specifically, because that would give you tools, these kind of practical behavioral tools to deal with the behavior, and then of course you also have to take care of the skin condition as well. How can thoughts be habits? Can you give an example? Yes, I can give you an example. So I'm a psychotherapist. Literally when people tell me anything, the immediate thought that I have is, what does this mean to them? I'm not going to ask it every time, but that's just how my brain works. Another example is a colleague of mine that I recently worked with, and she's not going to be upset that I'm giving this example. We worked on a paper together, and as we were writing the paper, there was 3 of us, and whatever idea came up, her immediate response would be, oh, this is not going to work because this and this, or they're not going to accept this reason for publication. This is not going to be accepted. This is going to be rejected. At one point, I thought, it's like, why on earth are you even writing the paper if it's not going to be accepted, if it's not going to be published, if nothing makes any sense? And her instinct is just to go for what's wrong. Most of us, I think, have a propensity to look at what we're missing. One of the reasons why we frequently have to cultivate gratitude intentionally is because our minds just immediately go for what we don't have. So that's one habit of thought that many of us have. When working with a client who has 33% TBSA burn with about 10% skin graft, are there other considerations? I'm not sure I understand the context of the question, because maybe because of when you sent it. So maybe you can email me. You have my email in the corner there, and then we can correspond over the email, and I would be happy to help you out and see if I can help you come up with something. Oh, just one brief remark. I know that in the last two webinars, I've received really a big amount of emails from you, and I'm really grateful, and I'm still responding to them. So I made a decision to dedicate certain time on Mondays specifically to respond to emails. So if you write me, by all means, write me anytime with any questions that you have. Just keep in mind that I will be answering them on Mondays. That way, I'm not going to skip anyone's email, which has been happening, and then I feel very bad, but it's just very difficult to find them all. How do we overcome the instant gratification of a pick, say taking an ingrown hair or clearing a pore, with the lack of this through a competing response? Yeah, that's a very good question. So my suggestion would be to see exactly like if that instant gratification comes, for example, because of the popping sound or the feel, then you can actually find a competing response that works for that. Many clients benefit from finding those very soft squeeze toys, squeeze balls, basically, or they come, I guess, in different shapes as well. Those that you can kind of clench in your fist, and then it's like a sponge of some sorts. So you can use these and then pick them, literally, just take off. There will be kind of expendable goods, but that's one thing that you can do. Or you can use the bubble wrap and then pop that. That also works for some people. So those are some things that come to my mind right now. But sometimes it's really not possible to get a complete replacement, like I said. In that case, you should really focus on how your body feels when you get that gratification. And then see, just kind of, if you do body scans, for example, or try a body scan, and that will give you the methodology for what I'm telling you to do now, which is to focus on that feeling of gratification. Like, is it in your hands, chest, face, arms, abdomen, legs, pelvis, anywhere? So just focus on that very intently and just observe it and see what pops up as an association for you. Because there have to be other things in your life that give you similar type of gratification, like no sensation exists in vacuum, right? So in that sense, it's exactly what I was saying in the beginning about art and music and mood and communication. That's the kind of maneuver that you need to do. This is not easy and it's not fast, but that's the best chance you have, is you kind of have to understand it on the level at which it takes place, which is not intellectual. Do shock bracelets work? I don't really know what you mean. If you mean like those habit-aware, keen-aware bracelets and those things, they can be useful, but they're never really the whole solution. But for the habit reversal part of the program, or if you do it yourself, they can be very good because they can help you raise awareness of your hand movements. And if you become more aware of them, then you can more easily replace them with a different habit. I think that maybe that's what you mean. Do you think wearing gloves is an effective strategy? Absolutely. Wearing gloves is not a competing response. So obviously wearing gloves is not a habit. You can make a habit out of wearing gloves, but gloves themselves are not competing responses. They're something we call stimulus control, but they're absolutely very effective, yes. My finger skin is in really bad shape, and I'm an OCD perfectionist type that needs to keep everything tidy and neat. But when I'm bored or problem solving or dealing with a stress-provoking situation, my body automatically goes to the imperfections on my skin. And even though I'm mindfully aware of myself doing it and don't want to, it's like I'm absent-minded and can't stop until I finish my thought or next direction. Other times I just get more stressed and the pain from biting too much is kind of what I deserve or something. So let me scroll down to see the whole question. I'm not sure what the underlying issue is with myself that I need to depend on biting my fingers when I'm so aware. Sorry about the long paragraph. No worries about the paragraph. So essentially what you're saying is that you are aware but not focused on what's happening. If you by any chance attended the previous webinar on mindfulness, you might remember that I was talking about sort of mindfulness having two components. One, awareness, and one, focus. If you focus on the breath, then that's what's in the center, and everything else that you might be aware of is the periphery. This means that you're not being mindfully aware of picking, you're being aware of picking, period. But if you're problem solving or whatever it is that you're doing, that is what you're mindful of. That's what you're focused on. So mindfulness in that moment, it is automatic because you're not being mindful of it. But if you're asking me so without going into, details about this, so if you're asking me what the specific solution would be for you, it might be to focus on stimulus control and not habit reversal. That would be, someone mentioned wearing gloves or wearing finger covers or wearing band-aids on those parts where you would normally pick. Or, like I said, for someone else, you can actually find something else to pick. So that way you will have a mindless action that you can do while you focus on your picking. Is skin picking the same as hair pulling? Well, it's not the same thing, but it belongs in the same category that we call body focused repetitive behaviors. So they have different names, they're different diagnoses in strictly formal sense, but they fall within the same wider spectrum of problems. Sometimes I feel I'm not ready to give up skin picking because it helps me get through stressful moments. Do you have any words of encouragement? I think I don't really do kind of the coaching part. It's like, you can do it. Of course you can do it if you want to. But I think what you said here is very honest. And I very frequently see people who even come to therapy, but they're not really determined to give up skin picking. Especially if they're younger clients, they will come because their parents told them to, or because, I don't know, their partner wants them to stop, or because there's kind of social pressure or peer pressure. But unless you're really willing to give it up, then therapy doesn't really make much sense. I think maybe what you can reflect on is what makes skin picking so unique for you. You don't have to, giving up skin picking is so hard because it's a unique resource. So skin picking gives you something that nothing else on earth gives you. You said it helps you go through stressful moments. I think it would be maybe useful for you to kind of see, why is it that picking helps you de-stress or helps you go through these moments? Why is it that nothing else does that? Like, what's so special about it? If I have to guess, I would kind of say it's because it allows you to avoid actually those stressful moments. But I'm just guessing because I don't know you, so I might be wrong. That's one thing. And if you want to find motivation, I think what would be useful is to look at two different things, but at the same time. To look at every situation where you chose not to pick your skin and see what these situations have in common, because that's kind of like an incipient change there happening already. So it's a different narrative, different strategy that you can generalize and use in different contexts. And the second thing is to kind of very carefully look at the consequences of picking. And then sometimes when you look at the whole picture, that's where you actually get the motivation to do it. But the fact that you're not ready now and that you're listening to this means that you're getting ready for it. So just hang in there. And also maybe try to get in touch. Like, there's a forum on the SkinPick website where you can read other people's stories and share your experiences. That might help you. A sense of community can sometimes provide motivation. This is why last time when someone asked me about how to establish meditation as a habit, I said go to a place where, well, one day when we can't do that offline, or find a Zoom meditation group or something, because when you connect to other people who share the same interest or the same problem, you get motivation more easily. You talk about patience. What is patience? Wow. Now, this is possibly the most difficult question I've seen lately. I guess patience would be the recognition that things will not go the way you want them to go. That there's a certain pace that things have that you cannot change, and then making peace with that. That's what comes to my mind. I mean, specifically when I talk about patience and introducing new habits, what I really mean is that you cannot tell your body how fast something will become automatic. It will become when it becomes a habit. There's nothing you can do. You can maybe accelerate it by being mindful and diligent and learning, but your body will do things at its own pace. The same way that we have no choice but to be patient with COVID, because what am I supposed to do? How can I change the epidemiological situation, right? I can't. It will change when it changes. So that's what it is. It's acceptance that things have their own pace of change. And thank you for the question. I'll have to think about it more. I'm always giving myself the excuse that I can only change habits if I start going to sleep early, to wake up early and have a routine. Could I really stop picking by doing that? Well, on the surface of it, I would be very skeptical that this will be the ultimate solution, but having a regular sleep routine will certainly help you de-stress and rest better, so and can regulate your mood and lower your anxiety levels a little bit. So it will certainly help. But skin picking is a problem in its own. And also, this really sounds as an excuse in the sense in which people say, you know, I will stop picking, but you know, it's Thursday, so I'll start on Monday. Or when people say things like, I will start my diet on the 1st of next month. That usually means I just don't want to start. Because if you want to start, you can just start now. So I think the fact that you recognize that this is an excuse is actually a very good starting point. Say no to the excuse and just start tomorrow. I understand competing response for physical actions, but could you explain more about how or what would be a competing response for a thought habit, like a negative thought that's very intrusive? So unless you're talking about literal intrusive thoughts in the psychiatric sense of the word, in which case I don't think my advice can be applied that easily. I mentioned something that was really a good introduction to this. I mentioned how we sometimes have to cultivate gratitude because we have a tendency to have a thought habit of thinking in terms of what we don't have. And because we think in terms of what we don't have, this is why consumerism is thriving and is very much alive. Because we see something, we say we don't have this, then we must absolutely have it. So the solution to this is to slowly and intentionally balance out the way you think. If you have a tendency to have negative thoughts, it is never, ever the solution to go the opposite way and say, I will now only think positive thoughts. It's like telling a depressed person to cheer up because life is really great, or telling an anxious person to just freaking relax. It never works. Like telling people who pick their skin, oh, just stop. Doesn't work. So you cannot go from one extreme to another. This is where Kelly can actually be very helpful for us. So you have negative thoughts on one side, you have positive thoughts on the other side. Those two patterns of thinking constitute a construct. Which one it is, I don't know because I don't know you specifically, so you would have to explore that a little more. But we can hypothetically say this is a dichotomy that you're working with. According to Kelly, true change doesn't come when you go from black to white. Because black and white at the end of the day are just different sides of the same coin. So there's no intrinsic change happening. The change goes when you kind of turn the axis upside down. When from black to white, you actually go from, I don't know, blue to green, or different shades of gray to other different shades of gray. So what you basically do is you take what's good from the negative, take what's good from the positive, and just lump them together. You can do this also as an intellectual exercise and then devise a way of thinking that would incorporate both. Negative thinking gives us a lot of trouble, causes anxiety, makes us depressed. That was just annoying also in some days as well. But there is benefit as well to negative thinking. I was talking just about 10 minutes ago about skin picking as a way to self-soothe. So obviously skin picking is a problem, but if it's a way for you to deal with your stressful emotions, then it's also a solution. It's not just a problem. And the same is for negative thoughts. Negative thoughts are often ways for our mind to be prepared. Evolutionarily speaking, we have a tendency to generate negative thoughts because that's what helped us survive. When we were, like 100,000 years ago, our early ancestors, they lived in a very dangerous world. They didn't have half of the tools that we have. They didn't have the civilization. They barely had any kind of, it was very much every man for himself. And you also didn't have nice roads or, safe houses and doors and windows and stuff like this. And when you're in some forest and you hear sounds or screeching noises or, I don't know, branches breaking, it was the most beneficial thing to assume that it's deadly danger. Because if you assume it's, I don't know, like some sort of a dangerous, like a bear, for example, and you run away, you survived. It doesn't matter if your thought was true. It doesn't matter if there was any actual danger there, because you survived. So our brains kind of got into this transgenerational habit of thinking negative thoughts, because our brains essentially don't really care about what's real. Our brains generate thoughts, and these thoughts are supposed to give us tools to act in the world. If a negative thought saved your life, it did what it was supposed to do. Our brain doesn't care what corresponds to reality and what doesn't. So negative thinking very much has a purpose. Obviously, I will make the assumption that wherever you live, you don't have any bears or tigers lurking around. So that's kind of maybe too much. But you have to acknowledge that there is something good about negative thoughts. So you need to be rationally prepared for certain situations. And then you also need to make sure to have a balanced view of these situations, because negative thoughts are like filters and positive thoughts are too. They kind of leave some things out. They give you an incomplete picture of reality. When you merge the two, you will get a more complete picture. So you have to be prepared because that's what your negative thoughts want. And then you slowly have to introduce a little bit of positive thinking. So for example, my webinar may be drawn out and boring to you, but at the same time, if you learn, you may have learned something interesting. So it has a downside, but it has an upside. Overall, the image that you get is neither positive nor negative. It's something else. So that's the way that you can work with negative thoughts. You can find a way of thinking that will incorporate both negative and positive, and then make a point of intentionally thinking that way. When you catch yourself having a bad thought, pause for a moment and then rephrase it. If you're alone, do it out loud because that works even better. Slowly direct your brain. That's how you create a habit. The same way you would repeat a response until it becomes habitual, you also instruct your brain to go in a certain direction until that becomes habitual. People who meditate do this all the time. We don't rephrase our thoughts, but we learn how to let go of thoughts. So I kind of, when I have these thoughts, I sometimes like see them fly by, basically. I don't really react to them. So that's a habit of thought. It's how I relate to my thoughts as well. I hope that helped answer your question. I feel like I suppose picking increases when I'm sad or upset or stressed. Being a coping mechanism makes sense, but I absolutely hate it. I use laced gloves when I'm home alone, which helps, but it's embarrassing to wear anywhere. Yeah, exactly. And so one thing where I have to maybe correct myself, it is a coping mechanism, and sometimes it's a solution to a problem, but it's not a good solution. Obviously, it's not a good solution. It's just the best one you have right now. That means that you can see which part of picking actually helps you with stress, and then see if you can extract that specifically, and then work with it later on. So you can actually use picking, which is a problem, to learn about how your body needs to be de-stressed, and then find a more appropriate way to do that. Your examples along the way are great. Well, thank you. Did I miss the webinar for today? I'm afraid so. Will the recording be emailed to us even if we don't purchase the program? Yes, you don't have to purchase the program. You will. So all the webinars are for free. So recordings are also for free, and all the questions that I answer are for free. And the app that you can use, the SkinPick app, is also for free. The only thing that you pay for is the program if you want to join. But if not, you can join us every time here. I hate journaling. Is there any other way to make sense of what I'm experiencing? Sure. I don't think, personally, for example, I don't journal very much, but I spend 90 minutes every day observing my mind when I meditate. And because I work with my clients, I kind of have an obligation to constantly monitor myself. So for me, that's a habit of thought by now. So that's how I go about analyzing myself. So you don't have to journal. You just have to maybe, if you want to work with things that are not verbal, draw, paint, find a creative outlet. That's also a good way to learn about yourself. What are the ways that you could reward yourself? This is a very subjective thing because, again, we're dealing with whatever your body would consider to be a reward. I will tell you what I use. Well, what I used for the meditation example in the afternoons, but well, I cannot hear you laughing, but I will feel you laughing. And don't say I'm 150 years old. I really like the taste of Jell-O. So what I did was I would finish my afternoon meditations with mindfulness of eating. I would just eat Jell-O very mindfully for 10 minutes. My body finds the texture and the taste of Jell-O incredibly rewarding. So that's what I did. To me, that was the ultimate reward. In fact, I might have one after the webinar now because I truly, truly like it. And I can feel you laughing, so stop it now. But yeah, for example, for my body, that was a very good reward. Sometimes I would also add music as part of my meditation because technically speaking, when you do mindfulness, you can focus on any object, internal or external. So you can also focus on sounds. Then I would select pieces of classical music that I like, but that are rather simple. So not something that has orchestration. I would use parts of Schumann's childhood scenes, for example, because they're very slow, or Satie's music, which is very slow and very simple and very emotionally, it's very moving. So I could observe the sounds and also the way they resonate within me. That was also very pleasurable for my body and my mind, and it was also very engaging. So that's the way I would go about doing it. What if picking is because the dislike of bumps? Picking is a way to remove bumps and make them seem more tactile and smooth. So there are several aspects to the experience of picking. I didn't go into these details today because that's just not something that was the topic. I think we talked about that once, but I'm not sure exactly when. But sensory aspect of picking is very important for some people. In those cases, I will actually advise worry stones, but not the ones that you can purchase online or something like this. What I usually ask people is to go and find one themselves. Think about the kind of texture that actually feels good under your fingers. Just focus on that and kind of research that a little bit more. Practice with your skin or other surfaces as well. And then you can also keep it like a piece of textile close to you as well, if that's something that would replace the sensory sensation. But yes, if the sensory aspect of picking is important, then by all means choose that as the main method. So you can go, you don't have to, when we talk about competing responses, I often talk about things that you buy. I don't know why, because I guess I'm the victim of the same consumerism that everyone else is. But you can actually find competing responses everywhere. I had a client once in Skinpick who lived close to the ocean, and she actually went to the beach and spent some time sort of intentionally searching for stones that would work for her. And then not only did she find a very good competing response, but also it had a meaning because she created a whole ritual around it. So it was kind of additionally meaningful, and she had, more motivation to use it. Thank you so much for such an encouraging webinar. I also appreciate art-related references. Finally, someone, thank you. No, I mean, thank you for the compliment about the webinar, but finally, someone who likes my art references. Because last time, or the time before last, someone wrote and something along the lines of, could you have found a more obscure art reference? I didn't respond to the comment, but secretly my response was, I could have done more, and I could have done worse. What kind of gloves do you recommend? Again, anything that will work for you. If you insist on using your phone or iPad or something like this, you might want to use their specific gloves actually you can purchase that are phone friendly, so you can use those. But considering that people very frequently pick while they scroll through social media, you might actually want to use very thick gloves that will prevent you from using your phone. So think about what uses you want of this. If you don't want gloves, you can really get just latex finger covers, for example. They're like gloves, but they just cover tips of your fingers. That's more convenient because you don't sweat and you're not otherwise sort of prevented from using your hands. What was the ring you mentioned earlier that swirls? So it's a spinner ring, which along with my pen fell down to the floor. So it's basically a ring that has two rings in one, so you can spin it while it's on your hand. So it's like a very nice way to keep your fingers active. And since it's just a ring, you can use it anywhere. So it's very convenient that way. So spinner ring. I would like to know if you have any books on Audible speaking on this very topic. I don't have any. I've never written books about this topic. I might one day, but haven't yet. I haven't found anything on this topic on Audible. I haven't checked lately, but about a month ago I did check because someone asked me to check. There are decent books that you can purchase on Amazon or wherever you buy books, or Kindle and stuff like this, but nothing on Audible, unfortunately. If a habit is a negative thing, like not doing something or avoiding it fearfully, how does one add a positive habit to this lack of action. So if something is a negative thing, I wouldn't, I guess it is a habit, but then you're not phrasing it right. So if your habit is to not, I don't know, I would need a more specific example, but what I'm thinking about is experiential avoidance, for example. When you procrastinate so that you don't do something else, the habit is not to not do your homework, for example. The habit is to avoid doing your homework. So the habit is always a positive thing, even though the purpose it serves might be to avoid something. So it's not the lack of action, it's experiential avoidance. So that's a slightly different topic. It's a topic that I addressed a little bit in the webinar about emotional regulation, but that's something that in my opinion deserves, I will put that down on the list for so you can choose it next time as well. When I try not to pick, my skin becomes itchy. I know it's mental, so it makes it so tough not to pick. What can I do to fight that mental issue? So your skin itching can actually be both physical and mental. If it's mental, it's a sign of anxiety. So maybe you can implement relaxation exercises, something simple like different types of breathing, like 3x3 breathing, or grounding, or box breathing, or you can also use some more complex relaxation things like progressive muscle relaxation or something like this. So it's usually a manifestation of anxiety, but there are also a lot of anti-itch creams that you can try and they will work. That's something also you can try. They're over the counter, so you don't need any prescription for them. When I pick, I sometimes feel like I'm injecting myself with a drug. Obviously, I don't want to do that, never have, but what can compete with what I assume must be an endorphin release, and I'm not going to start running. I would never recommend anyone to run. I think running is the most boring thing in the world, so you're safe from that recommendation for me. I think this relates back to that question that someone asked about that kind of very important thing. Keep in mind that sometimes when the urge to pick comes as a need, let's say, to relax or self-soothe, because what you're describing here sounds like a way of self-soothing to me, but again, correct me if I'm wrong. If you need to self-soothe and the urge is very strong and the release is very strong, if we just look at that as a piece of information, what does that tell you? It's like if you go for a long walk and then you come back and you're thirsty. When I go on my 25-mile walks, it happens to me sometimes that I actually forget that I'm thirsty. And then when I go home and I open the fridge and I start drinking water, I suddenly drink all the water that I have, and then usually my stomach doesn't react very well. But my point is that when you start doing that, you realize how great the need is because you've been ignoring it the whole time. So the trick in these situations is to observe how the urge or the tension that precedes the urge, how it accumulates and becomes stronger. And then try to catch it before. That way you will not even need the intense, what you call endorphin release in that moment. So you can work around the endorphin release, even if it's very hard to replace in the same intensity. And yes, I wouldn't recommend drugs either. So we're on the same page there. Thank you for your support in providing the webinars and video material. Well, you're welcome, it's my pleasure. Going to bed late is a habit, how do I change it? Oh, there's quite a lot that you can find about sleep hygiene. That's quite an issue in medicine. There are many things that you can do. I would have to know the specifics of what is happening so that I could help you. But some things include like, don't use your bed for anything except for sleeping. Try not to be in the bedroom unless you're actually going to sleep. You can then you can remove your phone from the room. You can use white noise machines or anything that will help you relax. You can use self-hypnosis for sleep, or what people often call meditation for sleep. I have to use quotation marks because if you fall asleep, it wasn't exactly meditation, was it? But that works. So that's one thing that you can do. Create stable environments so that you have the context to situate a habit in, and then see what is the easiest thing for you to use to fall asleep, and then use that as your crutch until it becomes automated. That would be the simplest, most general advice. But I really strongly suggest that you Google sleep hygiene. You will find a ton of resources in that. And there are people who know much, much more about this than I I've tried almost everything. I've tried taking down mirrors, meditation and mindfulness gloves, setting timers, journaling result, hypnosis, therapy, medication. Nothing has helped. I'm very anxious and have bipolar disorder. I don't know how to get it to truly stick. Is there a more advanced way to cope when it feels like you've been practicing advice, but it doesn't seem to work short or long term? I've been ready to quit for so long and have hope. I'm just lost where to go next. I'm really sorry that you're experiencing this. I have seen this in the past as well, especially with people who have a serious comorbidity. So when you have skin picking plus another issue. The reason being that bipolar disorder, I guess I don't have to explain to you how you feel, so you know best. The thing is that maybe in the beginning, you can try addressing it with medication. And I don't, if you've been to any other webinars, you know that I reluctantly recommend these things. But I think in this case, if, for example, there's intense anxiety or restlessness or some kind of tension, you have a very hard time dealing with or coping with. In that case, medication can help, at least in the beginning, until you have it under control to lower it. So that's something you can discuss with your psychiatrist, whoever is prescribing a medication for bipolar as well. And then another thing that you can do is, so I know that you said that you tried mindfulness and meditation. I wouldn't recommend, because of bipolar, that you try it on your own. But if you find a qualified teacher, they might be able to help you. Because in cases when with bipolar disorder or psychosis or complex PTSD, mindfulness can all still be beneficial. Although there are obviously less studies with this, but we know that it can be beneficial. But you need a very highly qualified teacher who can slowly introduce that. But maybe if none of these work, try combining them with medication. You weren't really very specific about the type of medication you tried. So if you haven't tried anything for anxiety, that's the way to go. If you can try also NAC, that tends to work after 12 weeks of very high dosage. But then again, in your case, I would still consult with your psychiatrist. The reason I'm referring you to your psychiatrist all the time is because I don't know which medication you're taking and why. So only someone who follows you for a long time knows this. So no matter what studies I've read, your psychiatrist will certainly know better what they've tried and what's the reasoning behind this. I have been in therapy for some time, and now I'm really focused on getting rid of the negative and bad feelings that I have grown up with, and feel like I view picking my face as a continuation of getting the bad stuff out, like the hard, ugly underneath my skin. My mother also has always picked on me as well, so I feel like I continue this picking by myself. So there's no, oh, there's a question below, sorry. Is this a crazy way of thinking about picking? No, I don't think it's a crazy way of thinking about picking at all. I think symbolism plays a very important role in the way our psyche works. In fact, connecting things symbolically and making associations between things is the very fabric of our psychological life. So every symptom has a story like yours. Because you're obviously in therapy, you know that story. Many people don't. So I hope people can appreciate this. I think maybe in that case, you can work on picking on this kind of behavioral level. But I think it would be interesting to view that through how you can change your family dynamics and also maybe how you relate to yourself. Because if your mom picked on you as well, and this is a continuation of that, then maybe you kind of learn to relate yourself through the way she did. So maybe that's a form of punishment, or being too hard on yourself, or lack of self-compassion in some way, or self-love. That's a very interesting and a very deep way to think about it, in a very fruitful way. So I don't think it's crazy at all. I think it's complex and difficult, but definitely worthwhile to explore. This has been great and very helpful. Thank you for presenting it and taking your time to answer questions. Well, you're welcome. I'm glad it was helpful for you. What is the difference between self-care and reward? Well, self-care doesn't really have a precisely defined meaning, because this is something that we use for anything, really, from meditation to personal hygiene to whatever Goop is recommending these days. So self-care is like a very, very general term that doesn't mean anything specific. When I'm talking about a reward, I mean giving something that will be truly pleasurable to you. Some self-care routines might not always be pleasurable. Since I've been mentioning mindfulness like 1,000 times today, let me not break this tradition. Mindfulness, for example, is something that I truly deeply love. But at the same time, mindfulness is not always very rewarding because mindfulness means sitting with your experience. And pardon my R-rated language, but my experience is very shitty on some days. So when I sit with these very intense and horrible emotions, it is not rewarding and it's not nice. It is self-care, but it's just not very rewarding in that moment. Reward has to do with that immediate gratification that people have been mentioning today. So reward is something that feels nice right now. So self-care can but doesn't have to necessarily be rewarding, whereas reward is obviously rewarding. I hope that clears up the distinction for you. So thank you all for the compliments. I feel kind of unpleasant reading all of them. It sounds like I'm praising myself since I'm reading them. Especially, thank you for your webinar. It was very helpful, especially the importance of patience and the concepts of self-compassion. Thank you so much. Well, I tried to avoid mentioning self-compassion because I thought I was going to start beating you over the heads with the concept since I talk about it all the time. But specifically with speaking, it really seems to be a very important topic that comes back over and over again. One second. You were talking about journaling and analyzing thoughts through meditation. Do you have a suggestion for a format or systematic way of doing this? I try, but I feel like my mind is elsewhere and goes down the rabbit holes that are really helpful. So every rabbit hole is helpful in hindsight. So if you journal, just let yourself journal and just go back some other time and read through this. I don't journal now, like I said, but I used to have a journal for like 7 or 8 years. And this journal included a lot of my mindfulness and stuff like this. And sometimes I will go back and go through it and I will think, my God, you thought this was meaningless, but it actually made sense from a distance. So I don't think rabbit holes are unnecessary. But let me just go back to very practical things. If you want to track your habits, then your journal can be like very simple bullet journaling kind of thing. You can make a table to assess your things. You can take like 10 minutes every day and then just list like 2 obstacles that you faced in establishing your habit, if that's what you're specifically trying to journal about. If you want to journal about mindfulness, I have about 2,000 ideas. The most common thing that I recommend to people when I teach them mindfulness is to use a very simple thing. Like after you finish your mindfulness sitting, sit down and write what was the most common theme to all your thoughts. And if you had any interesting sensations that you felt, just list them. And then once a week, take a little bit longer and just review these logs and see what repeats and what they have in common, and then journal more extensively about that. You can journal by trying to analyze it. You can journal by sketching. That's something that people often do when they deal with body sensations, for example. But you can also just let yourself write anything that comes to your mind. Just make sure to have these points like once a week, depending on how often you journal. When I teach people mindfulness, I usually insist, but only mindfulness, not in the form of therapy. I will insist that they journal after every session if they're very serious about it so that we can actually understand it in detail. So then once a week is a good point to take half an hour and review the logs and see what are the common themes. So that's one way that you can go about that. There are also mindfulness journals that you can buy. I don't like them because I prefer to make my own structure. I'm just that kind of a person. But you can maybe use these as well if they work for you. I like the Jello idea. Thank you. It's nice to see that there are people who appreciate Jello out there. You were talking about, sorry, I just didn't mark this question as answered. Thank you. I would really like to get rid of this childhood habit of picking my finger at skin. Do you think I can change it if it is a very long-term habit, more than 50 years? Yes. I just think you have to be mindful of the fact that the longer the habit persists, it will be more difficult to deal with. However, there is a silver lining to this, which is that if you started picking at a very early age, there's some stats that say that you might actually be more successful at treating it. I wouldn't take that as gospel, to be honest, but there is some research that says that if it's a long time thing, that it's also more easier to treat because you're more likely to devise effective strategies because you already know your habit very well. You are fabulous. Well, thank you. That's very nice to say. I'm 69 and have done this since I was young. When I got athlete's foot in elementary school, have to have skin smooth. Didn't realize why I did this until now. Soothing. Thank you so much. You're welcome. So then that's obviously your next direction to explore, which is different ways of self-soothing. And I mean, just Googling, you can find many things. Time to hit the sack here. Thank you for the webinar. You're welcome. Okay, let's do one or two more questions because there's like 20 of them that I still didn't get to. Do you have an opinion on MAC and suggested dose? So my opinion is basically what the studies show. I don't feel the need to have a personal opinion about it. So the studies say that after 12 weeks, it should reduce, I believe, peaking up for about 50%, more or less. The dosage in those studies was, I believe, 2,400 milligrams a day. I suggest that you go back to the webinar on the biology of skin picking or the science of skin picking. I'm not sure how I titled the webinar. I was presenting the study results there in more details than this. I wouldn't only do that. I would also try with habit reversal or the program, the skin pick, or maybe like one of the books that exists and kind of try to combine the two. Okay, so let me see. Boredom for me seems to be a trigger. Well, this would be a good question to end with because I really like this because I detest boredom and I don't believe that it exists. And you can quote me on that. So the reason why I say this is because boredom is a very uninformative state, psychologically speaking. What I would really encourage you to do is to research and think about what thoughts you have when you're bored. Because boredom just means that there's no particular object that you would like to attach your attention to. So that's what boredom means. There's nothing that tickles your fancy in a way. So in absence of something interesting, obviously the direction, the information that boredom is sending is change do something else. But the important part is to see what is it that you're thinking about and what is it that you're feeling in your body. Because this is what makes boredom difficult and not the lack of something to latch your attention onto. So think about that in those terms. Let me just, before we close, see the poll. Let me end the polling. This is a very tight race, I have to say. So 50% for habit reversal training introduction and 51% for skin picking trances and why they happen. So by a margin of error, trance it is, and that will be our topic for next month. And then maybe the month after we can use habit reversal, or I will make a poll for next time as well. Think about it because it's very close. It's like literally 2 votes difference. So thank you so much for sticking around in such big numbers as I see after such a long time. And I hope to see you in October as well. Stay tuned for the exact date of the webinar. And we'll be talking about trances and what and why they happen. Thank you so much. And thank you for your very interesting and difficult questions. I have to go in and ponder what patience is. Have a nice evening, everyone.